remember Rogers Foam for as long as I've been in Somerville, which has been all my life. It's known as a sweatshop. It's one of the many factories that lie along these railroad tracks. This is kind of like the industrial backyard of Somerville, walking along these tracks. The railroad tracks is someplace where you came and you sat down and you rested and you watched all of the wealth that was extracted out of the labor power of generations of workers pass you by, going to who knows where. The fact is that we produced the wealth and we never saw much of it, just scraps. Well, I found that the amount of wealth the working class is capable of producing has very little to do with the amount they actually get to consume. It made me feel pretty much like an industrial slave. I never felt anything other than that when I worked in international paper right down here. When I see workers coming out of this Rogers Foam, industrial slaves, wage slaves. It's a part of this system. It's been going on for generations. It only works to the advantage of the few. It makes me feel like people can never become full human beings under a system of industrial wage slavery. That in order for them to get dignity as human beings and to stop kowtowing to people with more wealth that they've stolen from them, they have to stand up to these people with wealth and say it's gone on long enough, that we want a full human status. We refuse to accept this slave status you've put us in, and it's better to fight and to die than to crawl around and to live. I've heard the big lie in this country for 48 years, and I've seen the actual reality of it, much of it right down here in these railroad tracks. Walk along these tracks, look at these houses, see how these people live, see how many are in them, see the types of factories they work in, and then come and wave the flag. Good evening. My name is Michael Quirk. I'll be the moderator tonight of a panel discussion whose topic will be, should the American working class start their own political party, a labor party? My guest in the studio, John Clifford, who's a restaurant owner to my left, Joe Power to Johnny's left, who's a carpenter, John Babin, who's a social worker, and Ellen Quirk, who's an office worker. Now, politics are often a result of personal experience that can traverse an entire lifetime. As a way of addressing this topic, should the American working class start their own labor party, I'd like to ask each of my guests a little bit about their personal experience, their life growing up in the working class. Johnny, I've known you most of my life, and I know that you've had a solid working class experience growing up in Somerville, traveling around with your mother, who was a single parent. Could you tell us a little bit about your early life insofar as your family was somewhat disorganized, the number of schools you went to? What was that like, being in the working class?
Well, at first I lived in Cherry Street in Somerville, and a great aunt died, and my father had left us, and we were in no position to buy the house, and we had to leave the house, which started us on a series of moves. So I went to many schools and many houses. We wound up in the projects on Mystic Ave. However, and we were waiting to get on welfare at the time, and before we got on welfare, we got evicted. My mother and 5 brothers, and I remember I was in the 3rd grade at the Moss School, and we made the front page of the Record American at the time. And when I went to school, all the teachers asked, what happened? I said, we got evicted, which took me on another series of evictions. So by the 8th grade, I went to 15 schools.
Amazing.
And I think that when I lived in the projects in summer, we used to go up to I think there was a Stop and Shop on Winter Hill, and we used to go up with little kids and take cots, take the food back for people who would pay us. And then when I was 8, with you and your brothers that started caddying at the Belmont Country Club. Now, one thing I remember about caddying at the Belmont Country Club, we used to go to Mass at St. John's in Cambridge first, take the subway to Waverly Oaks, and hitchhike up to the Belmont Country Club. And then one day, I guess a couple of times in our experience here, there was a strike of the caddies. And at the time, there was none of those vehicles that took the clubs around, so it was just caddies. And the people weren't used to carrying their own bags. So we had caddy strikes that were effective, and the older kids would not let other kids scab on the strike.
How old
So we
were you
won
at
those
that
strikes.
time?
Eight
Was
and
that your
nine.
first organizing? I know that you later became a union organizer and you participated in other strikes. Was that your first experience with a union organizing or organizing to get what you felt was rightfully yours?
Yes,
That was as an 8-year-old caddy at the Belmont Country Club.
right.
Now, when you traveled around going to all of these different schools, it must have been very difficult to become established in any one type of schoolroom situation to get some sort of basics in terms of learning and a feeling of security. How did you deal with that? And I know you were the oldest member of your family, so you somewhat acted as a father to the other kids in your family. So,
My brothers will kill you for saying that. I don't know if you ever get established. I don't know if you ever realize that you're never established. I mean, you just kind of, you find ways to survive and maneuver in those situations. So you move so much, you get along. You get to get along with a lot of different people and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think that you learn to do that as I moved. You know.
Did you start working at an early age too?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, I had jobs all the time through, starting as caddying.
Yeah.
Newspaper jobs, folding newspaper jobs, picking apples, plucking turkeys, working in different types of jobs.
So you always felt that it was incumbent upon you to provide some sort of income to your family because they were basically on welfare most of the time.
Yes. As a matter of fact, when I got out of, when I graduated from high school, I was 17, and there was 5 of us at home, plus my mother 6. The welfare department deducted me from the welfare rolls, from whatever they were given. Let's just say they were given $50 a month. They deducted me, and because I was the oldest male living at home, I was required to give 60% of my gross income to my mother, because I was, at the time, the oldest male living at home, and if I didn't, they had threatened to put me in jail. If I wouldn't do that, I'd be violating the laws.
Either that or you would have had to quit your job in order to be within the welfare regulations. Is that it?
Yeah, well, I left the state. But I mean, I was only 17, you know, and that was the requirement. And they were looking for me to bring me up on charges to pay that money.
Yeah. Now, Joe, I know that your experience was not as transitory as Johnny's because basically it seems that you've had a more or less stable family life. But in your early years in Somerville, what was it like? What was the neighborhood like that you grew up in the schools you went to, looking back into the, say, the early 50s, I'd imagine?
Actually, the late 50s.
It was the late 50s.
I was
We're a
born-
little
I was
older than
born
you.
in
Is that it?
51.
Oh, I see, Joe. Rubbing it in.
It was a fairly stable life. I mean, my father always worked, and my mother worked most of the time outside the house. I can remember my father was an auto body worker. I can remember him coming home dirty all the time, you know, torn up shirts, you know, from battery acid, you know, always sort of mean and swearing when he just came home from work. It was a blue-collar neighborhood, and I know that for a fact because when I was in school, I looked up the occupations of everybody on the street for the years I lived in the neighborhood. There was only one person who had a white-collar job on my street.
Where did you look up their occupations?
In the city index for
That's
those years.
interesting.
And it was a nice neighborhood. I mean, people were fairly close. We talked, and you know, as a result, it seemed like you know, my childhood was fairly pleasant. And I didn't really think that I was disadvantaged or anything. I thought I had a regular childhood until I met rich people when I went to college. That's when
Where did you go to college?
UMass Boston and Boston University. That's when I became aware that, you know, there was a better something. You know,
Yeah.
that there was, not only was there stability, but there was, people who had money. You know, their health was better. I mean, they weren't so insecure. They knew where their next dollar was coming from.
How did you fit in with those people? Had your prior experience in the working class acted in a way that it impeded or facilitated your adjustment to them? How did you feel about them?
Well, it depended. When I first went to college, I went to UMass Amherst, which was a much more middle-class school than UMass Boston, and it was slightly different for me there. You know, I felt sort of out of place. Not really out of place, but a little out of place. And when I went to UMass Boston, there were a lot of people like me, commuters, children of working-class parents, and I felt much more at home. I felt very comfortable there, as a matter of fact.
So you felt better when you were in a school where you could identify socially with the people that were your fellow students.
Right.
John, could I ask you a few questions? I know you've lived in Somerville just as long as me. That's been all your life. What was your life like in Somerville growing up, your early life, in terms of the schools you went to, in terms of the work that you did as a kid?
Well, I did well in school, but actually most of my I spent unusual long hours outside of school actually working. Not so much to support the family. I kicked in. I mean, I wasn't, let's say, an extremely vital cog. That is, I kicked in. We were expected to help out. But I started work probably about 11 years old in Boston, mainly just things like shining shoes, selling newspapers in Kenmore Square, the Combat Zone, whatever they call it downtown, their newspaper row. And all I remember, all through my school years, I just worked. Even in college, my typical summer was an 80-hour work week or something.
Was that out of choice, or was it from circumstances in your family that didn't allow you to have the money you needed to have leisure?
Well, we had to earn our money. My father was a railroad worker. He was disabled during World War II. They were working 16-hour days and 7-day weeks as part of the war effort. And he worked as much as he could, but he was often unable to work just due to his injuries. And it was, we worked because it was the easiest way for us to just get money. But we were expected to kick into the family a fairly large portion of it. It was out of necessity, but we were like poor rich kids in the sense we were both. The family didn't have a lot of money, but on the other hand, we were very poor, but then we had cash in our pockets because we went out and earned it.
Now, what school did you go to? What college did you go to?
I attended Brandeis University. I graduated from there.
Did you get a scholarship to go there?
Sometimes. I turned down a scholarship to UMass at one point, and I worked, like I say, I worked long hours in the summers to earn money, and I had the luxury 1 year of having a summer off only because I received unexpected financial aid. But usually, a typical summer ran about an 80-hour week, and even during a school year, 20 hours or more 20 hours was probably quite average, which was more than what was done there. That was unusual, I think, even for most people there didn't have to work, but just plain didn't. They had a lot of money.
That's amazing, the types of work experience I've heard from all three of you as young kids having to work like that. What about you, Ellen? I know you grew up in Dorchester. And what was life like for you growing up in a working class environment in Dorchester?
Well, I grew up in a housing project in Dorchester, and actually when I lived there I thought it was great because it was like we moved from a smaller place to, when we moved in the project, the rooms were bigger, but I didn't realize maybe till, like John said, till afterwards that maybe things weren't exactly, I mean, that other people did a lot better than that. But when we lived there, the thing that I do remember is that we used to swim every day because we were right at the rocks. But it was like, when I think of it now, it was like there were no lifeguards, there was no beach, it was just rocks, and you swim off the rocks. But
Is that
it was
Castle
great.
Beach?
Well, it's where UMass is now, but there was nothing there then. It was just a field and a dump,
Yeah.
and that's where they put the project, in the dump. And one of the other things that I remember about being there is that the dump trucks used to come down the mile road, they used to call it, and they'd come flying down there. And once a kid was killed, run over by the dump truck, and people in the project got together and wouldn't let the trucks go through anymore. That was probably the first thing. I just remember pushing one of my brother's sisters in the carriage. I don't know, my mother had a lot of kids, so I don't remember who it was, but I remember everybody got out to stop the dump trucks from coming anymore. And they did, they closed down the dump. But I mean, it took a lot of people to, everybody, it was very, one of the things is that it was very isolated, so that you really never saw what was going on outside of it.
You come from a big family then.
All right.
Did everybody work, all the kids? Or
Oh yeah, that was expected.
when did you start working?
Well, I helped like with kids, babysitting, and when I was 15 years, 9 months, I got a job in a factory where my brother had worked in a drapery factory in South Boston, and I worked there after school every day and in the summer. But everybody was expected to do that because they, she had a lot. My mother had a lot. My father had a lot of kids, and times were tough.
Did your studying suffer as a result? Or?
Well, I don't think that it suffered that way, but it suffered in the fact that I always wanted to go on to college, and I just knew that I was expected to work when I got out of school, not to go to college. So, yeah, that suffered a lot.
Yeah. I know eventually you did go to college, but
Right.
like all of us here, you were an older student.
Yeah.
Did that have something to do with growing up in a large family? And,
What, going later?
yeah.
Yeah, it had a lot to do with it. I wanted to go then when I got out of high school, but those opportunities were not there, and they were just not, you just didn't do that. And nobody that I knew did that. I mean, people, even a friend of mine got a scholarship, she didn't do it because she had to work. The family needed the money. It wasn't like you could just do that. And especially for a woman, that was one of the things, my grandmother would say, well, girls don't go, so it's sort of like that's an inbred thing, too.
Yeah.
So that kind of works against you, too. So, yeah, I thought that was a thing that I wished I had gone then, yeah, I wanted to.
Basically, that was my situation as well. I had to work from an early age, and I was unable to go to college, but eventually I was able to go as well. I liked how you described growing up in Dorchester and some of the experience you encountered there. I think at this point I'd like to show a tape of Ellen and her addressing some current problems in her life and how she manages to survive now as a working class female. Could we go to the tape now, please?
My name is Ellen Cork, and we're here in my backyard in Somerville, and I am a mother of 3 children, and a worker, too.
Economically, it must be difficult for you. How do you manage to get by?
I work the minimum I can to get by, because I want to be with my children, but I can't sacrifice any more than that. I couldn't do it. In fact, at this point, I almost have to work full-time because things have gotten so bad. Prices on everything have gone up so much. And my children still need things. They still need to eat, and they need clothing, and everything is higher. To me, it's very difficult for women, especially in this society. The way that we live, it's almost like people just expect you to do what you do and do it well, without any complaints, without any kind of help, really. It's very minimal, the type of resources that are out there for women with children. I think that with all the wealth in this country, considering that we've always talked about how great this country is and how wealthy it is and everything, I think that that people who work, just are working people, don't see the benefits of that. I know, my parents worked with us. They really have nothing to show for that. And I don't think anything could be worse. I don't see this as functioning in any good way, as far as I can see it. Maybe the corporations think it runs okay, but I don't. And I don't know a lot of people, especially at this time when economically things, people have no jobs, they're out of jobs, they're unsure of the jobs they have. Workers have been displaced and just told they're worthless. When you are not equipped to go out and make a lot of money to support yourself, if you can't get a job where you can earn enough to keep your family in the things that, basic needs, and it's very hard not to internalize that. But basically, I can always go back and say, well, I know why this happens. Even if I feel bad about it, I still know why. It's the way that it's done, I think, that is the worst, because it makes people believe that somehow they're not adequate. The way that they just throw them out in the street and say, well, you lost your job and it's your fault, or, there's no work for you, you're just not good enough. Or, I mean, it never comes back and says, well, you've never been trained to get these the other jobs that are out there, or, there's no support for them. They're just sort of left out there, and then they internalize all those feelings about themselves. And it just sort of adds to it and isolates them more. I feel that the issues that most people are concerned with are the education of their children, the health insurance idea of a national health policy for everybody, that nobody should have to sleep on a street, that basic human needs are so important to everybody. I mean, I don't want to, when I get down the street and I see somebody that's homeless sitting there laying, I feel very discouraged by seeing somebody like that. I feel like, what's going on here? This is what this is supposed to be a country where we have all this wealth, and yet this guy's sitting on the street begging for dimes. There's something wrong with that. Most working people don't even vote that I know.
Really?
Of my family, many of them, yeah. I think that they feel, what's the difference? It doesn't make any difference if a Republican or a Democrat gets in there. They all do the same things. I'm not really affected so much by that. Maybe once in a while there'll be an issue that they might have some sense of that it might affect them. But basically, no. I think that people basically have to realize that they're the only ones that are going to change it.
Hi. Ellen just gave us a vivid account of some of the problems she's facing now as an adult single parent living in Somerville. I guess we all have to grow up and leave our childhood and face different sets of problems. I find as a working class male that many of the problems I face now are quite similar to the problems that I faced as a working class child. They involve work and meeting people's expectations and trying to get a measure of satisfaction out of life and feel I do something worthwhile. It's never easy. Johnny, could you tell us a little bit about some of your life now, some of the problems you face, what type of work you do, and how in general your work fits in with your quest for happiness in this life?
Okay, I'll try to give you a little quick background. When I was going into high school, I told the teacher I want to take the college course, and they told me this guy he was the hockey coach, and a big macho guy, and he laughed, and he said, no, you can't go to college, you're on welfare. You people don't go to college. So I took
Terrible.
the business course.
Yeah.
And when I got out of high school, I worked in kitchens, I worked as a busboy, and I worked as a bellhopper, a doorman for 4 or 5 years. And then I went in the service, and I went to Vietnam, which I would say that'd be the changing part of my life.
That was a crucial point in your life insofar as it oriented you in a new political or personal direction?
Both, personal and political direction, and I made it a point that I was going to go to college after Vietnam, which I did, which I went to UMass in Boston, and I worked at a housing project with kids, and I didn't think that was enough, that did enough to change society, and I made a determination to do something else, and I worked for 5 years for SEIU of Local 509. And after my
That's the Service Employees International Union.
Service Employees International Union.
Mainly with state and federal employees?
State.
State. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we organize, well, my wife and I and some other people organized the great portion of the union then. And when my wife now, girlfriend, then ran for president of the union and lost, we both got fired from that union. And people said you should leave voluntarily, but we're the last 2 people who ever left. There's been like 6 or 10 different leaderships in the union now, and no one's ever left since then.
That was the Christmas Day firing?
Yeah. And then I worked for 1199 Hospital Workers Union for 5 years. And there was a big international, big national fight within the union. If I could summarize it briefly, it was a fight between, I would say, the Communist Party members and the blacks out of New York City. And the leadership of the CP thought that they couldn't trust me in a big fight with the blacks, because I worked with a black guy from Boston, and that we might side with the blacks from New York, and I got fired. And I was actually blackballed from the unions after that.
Maybe we could discuss that a little more in the union
Well-
section.
Well, and I couldn't get a job, and somebody an older person wanted to sell a bar, and I wanted to buy it because I didn't know what else to do. So me and another guy bought it, and the intention of the bar was to set up a left-wing bar on one side and a jazz club on the other, which was Charlie's Tap, which we did do, except none of these lefties came into the bar, a large part. The working class people I knew came, but these people who are affiliated with unions and stuff, they did not come in.
Why was that?
I would say I should have realized that they didn't like me. Because basically they thought I was too working class, and they thought I was too tough, and they didn't come in. And then now it's evolved into a restaurant, and we do have music. It's the Green Street Grill and Charlie's Tap.
How does that compare with union organizing insofar as you getting a sense of satisfaction out of your work?
Well, I mean, it's a completely different satisfaction and stuff like that. I mean, there was more. When I was a union organizer, basically, I mean, I did everything in the union, but I organized people and I led strikes. And you can see people's lives change directly after they're organized into a union. And if you have a successful strike, that in 1199 and 509, people forget now, but in 1976, the entire state employees of Massachusetts went out and strike, and it was a very successful strike. It was a very upbeat strike, and people think it's impossible to do now. I mean, and that gives me a satisfaction to do, you know.
Yeah.
Owning the restaurant, I mean, there's different types of satisfactions when you see different things go good, but we also use the restaurant for different things. I mean, we had a dinner for the elderly. We had a dinner for the homeless and homeless kids, and we give presents to them. We had a dinner for the Cambridge Rangers and Latin basketball team. That stuff gives me satisfaction. We had a big AIDS benefit. That stuff gives me satisfaction. And, I mean, we do have, if you've ever been in the bar, we do have a lot of working class pictures that, I mean, I really put them up there so people would feel something about the workers.
Joe, what about you now? You're a real working class person in the sense that you're the only one among us who goes out and get calluses on your hands every day with the work you do as a carpenter. What kind of satisfaction do you get out of your work as a carpenter? You used to be a school teacher. Now, if you had to compare those two occupations, which one gave you the most satisfaction?
Well, each of them have their own particular kind of satisfaction. I still teach and I get satisfaction from that, although it's part-time satisfaction because it's part-time work. I get satisfaction from carpentry work when things go well and you get a lot done, and it's a nice day, which happens most of the time, but not all of the time. Sometimes it seems things go backwards, and it's not so fun. But I've been in the Carpenters Union for about 8 years now, and it's not a bad place to be. You have benefits, you have some protection from, unfair, I guess what you'd call unfair labor practices.
Sometimes you work, actually, too, right? Once in a while. If you're lucky, you get a job.
Yeah, well, I had a nice run of work in the 80s. As a matter of fact, for being a construction worker, I didn't miss much time. But in the last couple of years, work has been terribly slow.
Yeah.
And most construction workers have been lucky to work 2, maybe 3 months a year. That's since 1988. Yeah, now you're really fortunate if you can land a job and hold a job for a few weeks. Mm-hmm.
So things have changed dramatically in this state in recent years in the construction industry insofar as employment goes.
Right, things have changed dramatically, and it doesn't seem as though they're going to get better in the near future.
John, what about you? Now, you've been a social worker for almost 20 years now. What kind of satisfaction do you get out of your work?
Well, Well, things are very difficult right now. We're dealing with it's a very difficult job right now because we're dealing with increasing caseloads because of the economy, and you help people out. I honestly get more satisfaction out of the union aspect of my job. That is helping people I work with solve their problems, or at least obtain hearings for grievances. Being part of more of a collective that is an established union that has a very large organizational structure, and in some senses we can, if we don't advance at this stage in time in history, it's at least we can do a fairly effective holding operation. In that sense, I obtain satisfaction on the job or even outside the job. But the job itself is, well, it's like the quality of life in the country for working class people. I think that's deteriorating considerably. That's a deliberately orchestrated situation. That is, working people's lives in general are in fact deteriorating, and that's not by accident.
Yeah, I agree with you. And as a welfare worker, you must see that very directly, vividly every day.
The worst part of it, I think, occurs when you see people who never, ever, ever thought they'd be walking in your front door, you know, who bought the song and dance, and all of a sudden find themselves, you know, in a situation where they're just like the people sometimes they talked in negative terms about, and all of a sudden they find that they're not that different after all. Tragic events or just misfortune can hit anybody, especially if you're working class. You're only one paycheck away from poverty by and large. Most people, certainly in Somerville, maybe in Arlington, you're 2 paychecks away.
Yeah.
But there's really not that great a distance if anything ever happens to you at all. And people's lives in general are deteriorating, at least on the economic end of it. And I'm sure that has ramifications all over the place.
Ellen, in that film clip that we just watched, you explained some of the problems that you encounter as a working class woman. Have you noticed changes in the neighborhood or in the schools that would indicate to you that things are more difficult nowadays for working class people and that they don't quite know what to do?
Well, yeah, the schools especially, because they're cutting almost every program that's in there.
That's
And they're not even guaranteed that the programs that they haven't cut won't be cut by September. So yeah, it's deteriorating at a fast pace, faster than I've ever seen it. And as far as I know, the music program is completely gone, the in-school music program. I think now you can pay outside of school. I'm not even sure whether they have that or not. The class sizes are going to, I think, I don't know to what extent, but they're going to change. And some programs are going to be completely eliminated. And that's sort of like what's going on right now, is that they're trying to decide which ones or how much. But there'll be a lot of changes, and I mean, there are a lot of changes, and they're happening right now.
So
Quickly.
it seems to me, in view of my position as a postal worker, I see it at work, that now the question is, how little can we get by on, rather than we want more, we want a better life. It's tighten up your belt, folks, because times are rough, and you better keep your mouth shut if you want to keep your job. Now, we've all been involved in unions or in work situations where unions played a part. Tell me this, what can unions do now to stem the tide of the deterioration in working class life that we've been discussing? What can they do, if anything? Do you see much hope in the unions playing a major role at this time in increasing the standard of living of working class people?
I don't know. They haven't done much, as far as I can see right now.
The membership in
They're
unions
afraid.
is deteriorating too, and unless they organize more people and have more clout, I mean, they'll never be a force in American politics again.
The numbers each year have gone down. It's now 16% of the American labor force is organized into unions. So do you think that's one indication of their diminished power, the decline in enrollment?
Yeah, I would. So
Yeah,
that's
I
an
mean, and also,
indication.
why aren't they speaking out against things that are going on, too? You know, I don't see them speaking out against concessions being taken by people in unions and outside of unions. I mean, why do workers have to take all these concessions when the federal government is taking money and using it for the wrong things? I mean, who's going to speak out for people who are working and need that money? I mean, there's nobody, I just see it so scattered, like they're not out there saying there's something wrong here. Come on, why should workers take concessions? Why do they need to do that?
You don't see the fight back. At times
I don't
in
see
this-
anything.
Yeah. At times in this country's history, there has been a lot of fight back. In the CIO in the 1930s, the unions struggled and used sit-down strike tactics. A lot of fight back further back in the 1890s. So we've had periods, but it doesn't seem like this is a period of fight back in the unions now. Does that mean we should abandon them and look elsewhere as far as some sort of vehicle to save working class people?
Well, I mean, the only reason that the union membership is so high now, at 16%, which is low, is for the public employees. That, I mean, not 15 years ago, the unions didn't even want public employees. Now they're fighting over them. I mean, the Teamsters and stuff like that. And the building trades people and the Teamsters and the people that had money, they squandered it or gave it away to their leadership. The leadership thought it was open for graft, and they didn't attempt to organize anybody, and they didn't attempt to develop leadership within the union, and they didn't take militant stances. And the consequence is that they're paying the price today. And some of the unions, 1199 is a prime example, had major infights, which the union disintegrated. I mean, and in fact, they no longer exist. And with Service Employees International, major fights within the leadership there, and in ASME too. And so the money that should have been used for organizing and develop rank and file people was used for infighting in some of the more honest unions and for graft, and some of the unions that were bent that way.
Let's look at a union that did fight back in Jay, Maine. We have a film clip of the strike in Jay, Maine recently that we'd like you to look at. And after this film clip, please join us. Call us in. We're here. The number will flash upon your screen, and we welcome any calls you might have about unions and what they can do during this time, or even about our lives growing up in Somerville.
There once was a union maid. She never was afraid of the goons and the gigs and the company fates and the deputy sheriff that made the raid. Went to the union hall when a meeting it was called. When the Legion boys come around, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die. Wait a minute. Let's hear it again. You can join in. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die.
How do we always end these songs right?
I don't know.
Hi, that was Pete Seeger singing Union Maid. There was a great example up in Jay, Maine of people fighting back, of trying to right wrongs and saying that this has gone on long enough. I think all of us in this studio feel this has gone on long enough too, insofar as the American working class has taken a real beating in the last 10, 15 years. And we're looking for ways to stop it. We don't know all the answers. We're just looking at possible answers. Do we need a Labor Party? Do the American working class need a Labor Party that will represent them, just like the parties of the Democrats and the Republicans represent the rich and those who own all the means of production? Do the workers need a Labor Party that will represent their interests?
They need something.
I'd say they need a Labor Party. I mean, they used to play the Democrats off against the Republicans, and now they play the Republicans off against the Democrats. And that strategy definitely isn't working.
Neither one of them represents us then, is that it, Joe?
Right. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans. I mean, the gubernatorial election last November was a good example of having really no choice. I mean,
Yeah, it's like things are getting worse. I mean, when I was growing up, I always thought, well, things will get better. You know, as you get older and you grow up and, you know, things get better. They don't get worse.
Automatically, huh?
Yeah, and I mean, I grew up in a project, so you'd figure, you know, things are going to get better. So
Must.
things kind of seemed like they were going to get better. And now, it's like things are getting worse than I've ever seen them. I never in my life, and even though I lived in a project, I didn't see people laying in the streets unless I went down into, like, Haymarket at that time. There were, like, if you'd see a few people who were drunk and they were in there. But now I see them all over the place. And those things are real visual and clear to me that things are not good for a lot of people. And I know there's a lot of homeless families. I mean, there's homeless shelters. This is like a way of life in this country now. I mean, when did you ever hear of that growing up? Even all the poor areas, I mean, at least you had a place to live.
Like Calcutta, who's doing anything about these
Yeah,
things? About
nobody.
homeless people lying in the gutters, camping out on the common, about all of the drug addiction that we see, about kids who are shooting
Yeah, it's
each other
worse.
in all of these different areas of Boston. Who's doing anything about this?
It's not, well, we're suffering from really a deterioration of social fabric. We ran out of momentum after World War II. Really, we lived on that. We grew up with the idea that things were inevitably going to be better for us, and that was just part of the post-World War II ideology. You know, we won the war. We've run out of steam. And people, for the last 20 years, everyone, when I look at the situation, the United States reminds me of Great Britain, the same, a receding economic power, a receding imperialism. And we're following their path. In the last war, they cheered from the sidelines because they had already been there. So they knew the act. We were still learning it.
This is the decline of capitalism that we're watching. And the United States, as the major capitalist power in the world, is in a post-war decline.
It's the decline of the United States. I don't know I don't want to get into whether it's the decline of capitalism. I don't know if I'm capable of really making statements like that. I don't have any real analysis of the situation. I can see what everybody else does going on around me. It's certainly deterioration of the quality of life within this country. That's obvious, and that's orchestrated. That's not by accident. That's because the people who have the money want it that way.
And this deterioration of the quality of life, it seems to me, is hitting the working class hardest. Now, it gets back to the question, what can we do about it? Can we use the unions as a vehicle for creating some sort of party that will represent working class interests? What hope do the unions offer us in so far as creating a new politics in this country, politics based on class, working class interests?
Well, I think the unions would have to be included in any kind of a labor party, right? How could you have a labor party without unions, right? I mean, they might not be doing much now, but certainly you need union people, labor people.
Leadership, though, I mean, you can't tell me that the people who are in there now.
You need some new leadership. Maybe a lot of new leadership,
Yeah.
but there are some good leaders, right?
Yeah. Well, where are they? Come on, Joe. Where are they?
Well, Ron Carey, we talked about
All
Ron
right,
Carey
all right.
before.
Who else?
Do you think there's enough of
Who
them, though?
else? Who else? I mean, name.
Oil,
I don't-
chemical, and atomic workers?
And how many members do they have?
Well, not very many.
How many members?
I think 80,000 or something, under 100,000.
Probably much less.
Yeah. The most progressive unions are those that are the weakest. Is that what you're saying, Johnny? Like
Well-
your union, the SEIU, the hospital workers union.
Well, the hospital workers union, in fact, doesn't exist anymore. A portion of it is in SEIU, a portion of it is in ASME, and a portion of it is independent in New York City. There's probably the most progressive part right now, and they're fighting over SEIU and ASME are fighting over it and promising big bucks wherever they go. And probably UE has the best record of fighting back and fighting for contracts now and taking on issues of plant closings and stuff, but they're a very small union also. So certainly a Labor Party is one alternative, and I think that people want, if you ask people, if you do a poll, people want jobs, and people want health care, and people want nice housing and nice schools. How do you channel that energy into developing some cohesive movement? Or how do you get people to really feel that they deserve that and they're owed it and the government should give it to them? I'm not sure how you really take that on.
Is that such a basic question? People have become so demoralized within the working class that they don't even feel like they have the right to say they deserve a home, they deserve food, they deserve medical care, education. Is it reached such a deterioration within the working class that people feel they can't even ask, let alone demand these basic necessities?
Well, I think that's true. One thing that always struck me, when I negotiated contracts in hospitals, you know, you can't get into a hospital without insurance, and you know, everyone knows how much doctors make, and they didn't want to give the workers of the hospital insurance. Say, like, how do you expect to live without insurance? They say, well, we can't afford it. I say, yeah, but you don't let them in unless they got insurance, you know, and this seems odd to me that a hospital would take that position. And
Or that the carpenters may be homeless, or that people who make bread might be going hungry. Isn't it a fact that that is a situation that often exists, that there are workers in these industries that do not have the right to claim the good or service that they are producing?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's happened. I think one problem with the strike in Maine is that they weren't militant enough from day one, because they thought they were going to win because they were united. It wasn't enough to be united. They had to be militant from day one. And a strike that was halfway successful was the post strike in New York City, the newspaper strike, where they were militant from day one. From the day that they got locked out of their plants, they fought and they had plans made and they were very, very militant. So they wound up winning something, where in they thought that that militancy was a bad thing in the beginning, and they weren't militant. And I think that's what has to happen in the unions. I mean, that people really have to build a militant rank and file movement, and I think that new leadership comes out of that militancy and the rank and file movement. And that's where the new leadership has to come from.
The rank and file, this old leadership is so reactionary.
Most of the top leadership in the unions now, I mean, they never organize anyone, and they never been on strikes. So naturally, it would be scary, or you don't know how to do it if you never did it, you know, and you feel like you're jeopardizing your position. Like if you were a carpenter, and one day then you're a union official, and you had all these nice little bennies, you know, you think you might be jeopardizing all that if you're going to take these workers on a strike or something.
Because if you don't win, then, you know, everyone's going to look down on you.
My union just settled for a bad contract. I'm in the American Postal Workers Union, and we got a contract that basically said no raises over the next 4 years. So I feel that settling for that sort of contract is a tendency that is pervading the labor movement now, that is in so little thought of fighting back, of demanding things now, that not only the leadership but the rank and file has so gotten out of the mindset of saying we work, we produce all, we deserve all, that they are meekly heading for the wings and taking whatever management is given them. And
Well, I've been so intimidated by them, Michael. It isn't that. I mean, workers are intimidated by that because if they lose their jobs, they know that they're going to go out in the street and, you know, what are they going to do? How are they going to provide for their family? How are they going to provide for themselves? I mean, they're intimidated by that. And not that, and I think that they isolate people who people get isolated quickly when they do speak up. You know, they separate them, and it's hard. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, certainly you want to see something happen, but I don't know how you do that because it is difficult.
When you compare this country to others, when you see what happens in other countries, very often what has to occur, and it's a very negative thing, is people really have to get repressed and hurt, maybe even more before they wake up. I like to believe I'm wrong in seeing things that way. Unfortunately, it's how I see things. I really do believe the situation may have to
What do you
deteriorate
think?
considerably.
Excuse me, the viewers would like to call in. Our number's up there on the screen. What do you think? We need help in figuring this out. How can we get a rejuvenated labor movement, a labor movement that's willing to address the crying needs of working class people now, and a labor movement that's willing to fight? How can we do that?
People don't usually, I think, fight back when they're repressed or they're low. It's when they have high expectations and when they can find a common grievance. Rise in expectations. When they find a common denominators, you know, where they don't think they're getting paid enough, they don't think there's any chance for advancement, and they have grievances against the boss. Those are the three common denominators that people organize against. Because if all the low workers are all the people who are really in the worst straits of the society organized, I mean, everyone would be organized.
That's right.
So things have to get a little better before workers are willing to take matters more into their own hands. Do we have to wait?
You persist in doing what you're doing. I mean, I'm working on a job it's a union shop. Your day-by-day reality, year in, year out, you do what you're supposed to do as an active union official, and things break as they break. I don't know what else one can do if you're already occupied in those areas. If you're an organizer, it's a different perspective. If you're somebody who's been working in the same place for a long time, that's very different from being an organizer.
You take Local 509, for example, now. Here's a union that at one time was very militant, one time did action, and here's a union that elected middle-class people educated in college, that people thought that they were more to the left and they had more left ideology, when in fact they didn't have any militancy, they didn't have any organizing skills, and they depended more and more on lawyers and more on grievances and more on court suits than in direct action, taking people out on the streets or strikes. And as that developed, I mean, you wouldn't believe 15 years ago that these people would sit by and do nothing today, but in fact, the leaders that they criticized 15 years ago for not being militant and not being this enough, I mean, they're like 100 times worse.
They become very bureaucratized, very
And
legalistic, yes.
very legal, everything's got to go through a lawyer,
Yeah, because
everything
they're
got
not
to go.
comfortable with that, like you said. They're not
Right.
used to going out on a strike and getting out in the
Right.
street and mobilizing people to do it.
Well, how do we break that mindset? How do we set the spark that will help them get out in the street where there's a lot of sunshine, fresh air, whatever, carbon monoxide, to get out there, leave their offices, their construction plants, their post offices, and say, this is how we're living, and we don't like it.
First of all, you have to change the laws. I mean, the laws that are that exist now prevent people from going out in the street, prevent people from having good picket lines, prevent people from going out on strike.
Johnny's an old lawbreaker from way back, Joe. He never
Right,
was
but people aren't used to breaking the law. Most people don't break the law.
In my job, when we ever got the most action, we broke the law. We've had crises within my local office where we've had to call work stoppages. I would have people from AFSCME who would represent the section of the office come down and say, do you know what you were doing was illegal? I said, of course I did. I said, but we were in a situation where it had gotten so bad that someone had to do something. So it was a calculated, we'd pull a calculated work stoppage. It was illegal. I says, fine, now get somebody, now the people who wouldn't do anything about our problems are going to have to come down here and actually do something. And our union leadership would actually come out of their office. We would never see them.
Yeah.
They'd have to do something because a crisis would be created. The work would stop totally.
I think that what John's talking about is the shop steward, or if there was an executive board person on the site, would call those job actions. It wasn't They didn't go call the union leadership and then call a lawyer and go this way. It was more direct action that, as John saying, that brought results.
That was outside common expectations and normal parameters. You just have to do something that shook everybody up, that would get their attention. If you went through the regular channels, you know, you could have your effect, but
Well, who makes the law?
not in a crisis.
Is it us? Is it the working class? Or isn't it, in fact, those who oppress the working class? Those who own all of the wealth in this society? And if we play by their rules, by their laws, how can we win?
If you curry favor with the establishment, it's a losing game. It's always a losing game to curry favor with the establishment. That's what everybody tries to do. It's a losing game.
Well, for the few at the top, it isn't. It's the rest of us that it's a losing game for. I think it's
What's our next move?
not our laws.
What's our next move as members of the working class?
I don't know. Maybe everybody should just not vote and all the blanks, they'll get beaten by the blanks. I don't know.
Might be a
what to do.
strategy. That's certainly something we see in
Well, I mean,
Somerville, blanks
50% of the
running
people
against
don't
blanks.
vote. Yeah, that's right.
You operate
At all
on
levels.
many levels. I mean, you have to participate in the political process as a matter of just, you're there, it's there.
voting too.
But when you become affected, quite frankly, like, for example, things like political violence, what upsets people is because it cannot be contained, or
we-
not
we have
easily,
to-
not by,
we
not
have
by.
to cut it off,
This is
yeah,
what
John.
upsets people.
We don't have all of the answers by any means, and maybe we don't even have some of them. But we've tried to address the problems that we feel exist in this country among working class people at this time. I'd like to thank all of the members of the Somerville Producers Group, and particularly Dave Riker, who helped us put on this program. And I'd like to thank all of my panelists. I think you did a wonderful job. Thank you for watching. In conclusion, I'd like to read a closing statement of my opinion of what's going on in this country at this time. The American political system is a plutocracy, a government by, for, and of the rich. It was created as such 200 years ago and remains such. It was created to prevent the majority from controlling the political system and to prevent the political system from controlling the economic. It is undemocratic. In a democracy, the majority control the political system and the political system controls the economic system. In order to begin making America a democracy, political and economic, we need to create a Labor Party, a party that represents the interests of workers and whose aim is to gain control of the political economy and to use that control to meet the economic needs of all people. Unless we make that beginning, our economic and psychological well-being will continue to erode. We will continue living in fear, cowardice, and insincerity. The price paid for continuing to do nothing is loss of our integrity. The reward won for fighting back, no matter whether we win or lose, is the reclamation of our human dignity. Thank you. It's like I used to look for jobs in all of these factories, and there was always a feeling of relief when they turned me down. So I had a feeling that it was the destiny of anybody who grew up in Somerville to end up in one of these sweatshops for the rest of their life, retire, live 6 months of a year, then keel over dead. I didn't want any part of that destiny. Somehow they managed to hang on in good times and bad times. The sweatshop survived. I guess they do it by the surplus labor coming now from South America, Central America, Southeast Asia, Haiti. There's always an abundant supply of labor to places like Somerville. And Somerville is no means unique. There's thousands of places like it across the country. They depend for their industry on an abundance of cheap labor. And the city still has it.